Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for Healthy Home, Healthy James, River Hero Homes, a webinar about the James River Association's River Hero Homes program. My name is Justin Doyle, Director of Community Conservation for the James River Association, and I will be your host this evening. Special thank you to Altria and DuPont Clear Into the Future for supporting River Hero Homes and making this webinar possible. Next slide, please. I'm very fortunate to be joined by my colleagues, Jamie Brunko and Aaron Riley of the James River Association, Jen Clark of the City of Richmond's Department of Public Utilities and RVH2O, Ryan Duckett of the Virginia Composting Council, and Laura Greenleaf of the James River Park System Invasive Plant Task Force. Next slide, please. During this webinar, participants will learn about the James River Association's River Hero Homes program and a handful of river-friendly actions that can be taken at home. I will kick things off with a brief overview of the River Hero Homes program. Jen Clark will tell us about stormwater and alternative irrigation. Aaron Riley will discuss the connection between dog poop and bacteria pollution. Jamie Brunko will discourage us from using herbicides and pesticides. Ryan Duckett will educate us about composting. And Laura Greenleaf will discuss the difference between native and invasive plant species. Feel free to submit any questions you may have via the chat box, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the webinar. All right, let's get started. So what is River Hero Homes? Well, every time it rains, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and bacteria from pet waste are carried into local waterways and ultimately the James River by stormwater runoff. This is stormwater pollution. Stormwater pollution adversely impacts the health of the James River and is the focal point of the River Hero Homes program. River Hero Homes is a community of stewards that realize the first step to a healthier James River starts at home. And the program empowers residents of our 10,000 square mile watershed to contribute to a healthy river at home by implementing river-friendly practices. In short, River Hero Homes is a solution to stormwater pollution. Next slide, please. To join the River Hero Homes program, residents of the watershed take a pledge and commit to a minimum of 3 of 5 river-friendly practices. The 5 practices are using alternatives to municipal drinking water for irrigation, picking up after your dog, reducing or eliminating the use of herbicides and pesticides, reducing the need for fertilizer by encouraging healthy soil with mulch and compost, and avoiding invasive plant species and using native plants to support wildlife and reduce watering needs. It's easy to join the program, and residents of the watershed are encouraged to join even if their home is an apartment or a condo. Next slide, please. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend Jen Clark of the City of Richmond's Department of Public Utilities and RVH2O. Jen, how are you doing this evening?
Peachy, thanks, Justin. We're going to jump right into a little bit of a deeper dive on stormwater so that we can talk about how to harvest it and harness it and then reduce it. We can go to the next slide. Okay, I've been holding on to this newspaper clipping from the Seattle Times for years, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to show it to you guys today and use it for the first time. Stormwater isn't inherently bad, but it can be bad. So on the left side of the screen, you see forested runoff, which is kind of a natural landscape. Doesn't have to be a forest, it could be a prairie. But in that landscape, vegetation would soak up rain when it falls on the ground, or it'd pool, but it would inherently run off and nothing terrible would happen. Take Seattle or Richmond or your favorite urban area, even suburban, on the right, and you've got rainwater falling on hard surfaces, which runs off those what's called impervious surfaces with an incredible velocity. That can cause different sorts of problems like erosion in your local creek, stream, or watershed. You can see that here in town, you don't have to go someplace gigantic to see that. We've got plenty of erosion problems in Richmond. You could probably name one for me, or in the James River watershed. And then it also picks up pollutants. So we can go to the next slide, please, Mason. And we'll get to talk about these kind of pollutants all day today. Aaron gets to cover my favorite, which is pet waste. It could pick up oil leaking from your car. It picks up litter. It picks up leaves that for some reason have been raked into your culvert or drain. And you don't technically need those extra nutrients in your waterways. It picks up extra fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides. You don't want any of them in there. We're going to have a little dance now as we just go through these slides. Sorry, back one, Mace, thanks. So when stormwater picks up these pollutants that might be unintentional, and sometimes they're just part of life, that causes stormwater pollution. There's two methods for reducing stormwater pollution. One is to reduce the pollution themselves. So checking for oil leaks, maybe not washing your car right on the street and letting all that soap go into your local storm drain, picking up after your dog, not raking your leaves into your ditch, being careful with trash, disposing of household hazardous waste properly. The other way we can help to both reduce pollution and the erosion and negative effects of stormwater pollution is to reduce stormwater as a general rule, which means somehow reducing impervious surfaces or harvesting stormwater when it falls. This also applies, just so we're clear, to snow. When it melts, that's stormwater too. So snow is just stormwater that hasn't really happened yet. We can go to the next slide. So to be a River Hero home, one of your 5 options that you get to pick 3 of is to use alternatives to municipal water for irrigation. Your alternative is pretty much rainwater in that case, or snow melt. Rain barrels are probably your easiest lift here. You could also go full blown cistern, but you need a pump and to be digging and call 811 before you dig. Rain barrels, you just get to connect to your downspout. This would keep water from, going towards your local drain or be part of a downspout disconnect. I can't resist this opportunity to show off these really attractive rain barrels painted by Richmond Public School students. These are a couple years old and have since found new homes, but they are lovely. For a rain barrel, you get to either direct your downspout into the rain barrel. So you would use like a connector and push it in, or the James River Association definitely has the hookup that you want to be on should you not yet have a rain barrel. And their connectors go directly into your downspout. So you never have to worry about an overflow because it would just pool back into the downspout when your rain barrel is full. We aren't going to go into how to outfit one today, but we'll cover some basics. You could paint them colorfully if you want, or you don't have to. You generally want to elevate them for a little extra gravity pull that tends to help, and you want them to be high enough to get either a hose or a watering can underneath. You do not want to drink with them. It's not potable water, so you should not be consuming it directly. And it's something that you can use to water your garden or your lawn. You also can, the best way to use rain barrel is to also empty it before it rains again. So sometimes that's a little annoying, that you don't really need to water your garden, but you need to go give it some extra love so that you can hold 55 more gallons or more, depending on how many rain barrels you have of content next time it rains. You also want them to be empty before a long deep freeze. That's essentially my favorite option for you for alternative to municipal watering. Cisterns, again, are your big other option. But I want to talk a little bit more, next slide, please, Mason, about the other ways to reduce stormwater, which number 1 is less grass. Grass is terrible at absorbing rain when it runs or when it falls. So you could plant more plants. You could increase the size of your garden, reduce the amount of turf you have. Trees are awesome at holding stormwater or rain in their leaves and in their roots. Also helps to reduce erosion. Native plants, which Laura will touch on. Healthy soil, which Brian will talk about in terms of compost, but healthy soil as a general rule, even if it's not through composting efforts, but that just a healthier soil profile absorbs more stormwater, which is excellent. Rain gardens, bioretention, and bioswales, if you are ready to dive right in, awesome solutions. Rain gardens are essentially puddles with purpose, so they're temporary, and they are designed to flood and hold water and then release it and let it absorb after a rain event. Pervious pavers and permeable pavement are awesome. They require some investment and maintenance, which is definitely my favorite word, but you can't just like sign up for it and then walk away. And green roofs are another option of how to harvest rainwater and keep it from entering the system. All this is awesome in Richmond because you also have our stormwater credit. So you pay a stormwater fee for the City of Richmond stormwater utility, and we're very grateful. It allows us to do a lot of important work and maintain your stormwater system. But if you're installing some of these practices, so rain gardens, rain barrels or cisterns, pervious pavement, and vegetated filter strips that can go towards a credit so that you can get up to 50% off your bill. It's kind of a headache. There's so much documentation on it, but I'm inserting the link and the QR code will lead you right there into the chat, and this will be saved forever for you to return to. We're also happy to help, and the manual will get overhauled, but In the meantime, we've got plenty of information about it. I'm going to turn it over to Erin for my favorite topic of all time. Not lying.
Thanks, Jen. So I am basically going to give you 5 minutes of gratuitous dog photos because I get to do that. So I'm here to talk to everyone about dog waste. It's pet waste in general, but for the most part, we talk about dogs because most people don't take their ducks and ferrets and exotic peacocks out on leashes for walks. So for the most part, we're talking about dog waste. Next slide, Mason. So one of the reasons why dog waste is such a problem is because we have so many dogs, which is great. If you are a dog person, you love your dogs, you love your neighbor's dogs, you love all of the dogs that you see, and that's wonderful. But we have so many dogs now that getting rid of all of their poop, or if everybody just left their poop out, it would be a huge problem. So right now in the United States, there's 90 million dogs, which if the average dog poops 3/4 of a pound of poop a day, and if there's 365 days a year, that means there's more than 24 billion pounds of poop in the US alone to get rid of. And if you think about, like, everybody uses one bag to pick up their poop and dispose of it, that's 90 million bags a day. So that's a lot of bags. And I definitely know some dogs that need more than one bag. And so the Chesapeake Bay program has done this survey. I think it was 2 years ago that they did the survey. And they found that 28% of people who live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed don't pick up the poop on their own property. So it's like 30% of people who are just leaving it out and willing to admit that to somebody who is doing surveys. On the other hand, 46% of people leave their dog's poop on the ground when they're not on their own property. And so there's this big disparity between when you're out in public and it's not in your yard, between, picking up your poop then versus when you're doing it at home. Even then, that's almost half of the population who aren't picking up their dog's poops. And so this causes lots of problems. When we have runoff issues like Jen was talking about, so that goes into our streams where it can cause algae growth, it can cause decreased oxygen in the water, and bacterial contamination, but it also, before it goes into the streams, it can cause issues with like worms and parasites and bacteria. It's a cleanliness issue. So I know a lot of people are concerned about, when you walk in it and then you bring that into your home and things like that. Also in urban areas, it's a huge food for rats and other rodents. And I know that's not a thing that I want to be seeing when I'm walking around in my backyard. I don't necessarily want to see rats scurrying away. And so, decreasing those food sources for rats and rodents can help to get rid of those populations around your house, but also in the city that you're living in. And so when we're talking about especially runoff and bacteria contamination, I just want to talk a little bit briefly about one of the programs that JRA has to look at bacteria contamination. So I'm going to go to the next slide. And this is our James River Watch program. So I don't know if you follow us on social media or anything like that, but we do that during the summer between Memorial Day and Labor Day. We run a volunteer water quality testing program. So every Thursday, we have volunteers go out across the watershed. So we go all the way from Buchanan and Lexington down to Newport News and Hampton. We have 31 sites, I think we're up to. So we've got a ton of sites that cover a large area. And we post the results to our website and to our social media accounts. And then if you're in the Richmond area, especially, there's an account that we have with one of the outfitting companies that automatically will tell you the air temperature and the river level at the Richmond tide gauge or Richmond water gauge. And so we post the results there as well. And so you can go out, you can see if the bacteria levels are too high or too low to see if it's safe to swim. And that's really why we've designed this program, is because we kept getting questions about if it was safe to swim or not. And this program looks at the bacteria concentrations, but it looks at a few other things as well and lets you know if it's safe to swim based off of our testing results. So what you can do to scoop your poo. So if you are going to use a plastic bag, use a plastic bag that you're going to get rid of anyway. So, you know, the 8 million bags that we collect from the grocery stores, that when we forget things, the bag that your bread comes in, things like that. If you can use compostable bags, with the compostable bags, you have to be careful because in order for them to break down, they need to get up to a certain temperature in the compost. Otherwise, they won't break down. And there's also doggy septic systems that you can get. That's, from what I understand, is the best way to get rid of them. But it's a little bit more expensive. And so we understand, you know, not everybody's going to do this, but at least by getting the poop off of the sidewalk, off of the grass, off of your lawn, off of your backyard, you're preventing that from going into the river, and you're preventing it from, you know, getting on people's shoes and things like that. So really scoop your poop. And then if you are interested in learning more or volunteering with us for the River Watch program this summer, you can go to the James River Watch website or the James River Association website and click on volunteer for the water quality monitoring program. And I'm going to pass it off to Jamie.
Thanks, Erin. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Jamie Bronco. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the James River Association. I'm going to talk to you about herbicides and pesticides and how that relates to another one of our pledges with the River Hero Homes program, which is to reduce or eliminate herbicides or pesticides. So you get the next slide. Yeah, so every time I go down to our local hardware store, I'm amazed at the incredible responsibility we put on consumers to, one, look at all the options there, to understand what is safe or appropriate for use in your yard, and then to make that decision. It's a lot of responsibility, and it's not an easy thing to figure out. But fortunately, there is a lot of information that you can find on the internet now, a lot of good articles that you can read to understand what the options are for conventional herbicides or pesticides and how they should be used, and also whether you really need them at all to begin with. A good rule of thumb that I like to follow when I'm at the hardware store and I'm reading a product is if it has some kind of special description on how you're supposed to dispose of it. So if you have a partial bottle and you can't just throw it away in the trash, you have to take it to a special type of facility to get dealt with. Maybe that raises a red flag, and maybe that's a good rule that you can use as well. But as general background, pesticides really refer to anything that's designed to control what we consider a pest, what humans consider pests. And generally we're talking about crops, but in the, for more commercial agricultural use, but in the sense of what we're talking about this evening, the River Hero Homes program, it's really for what you're using on your home gardens, in your backyards, where you've got hopefully some nice habitat for the local wildlife. And so there's a lot of options to be aware of, but some data that I found in helping to prepare these slides, just about everybody is going to have some type of pesticide at home. So 85% of US households have at least one thing. Several are going to have, or 50% are going to have much more, between 1 and 5. So again, how you use that and how you store it and how you dispose of it, it's really important because that can have consequences on the environment. Next slide. So, how do these things really affect the environment once they're released? Well, first off, we use an awful lot of pesticides in the United States. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, about 1 billion pounds a year are used to treat, again, primarily crops. 75% of the use is going towards the agricultural sector. And it's typically in these really large row crop environments: corn, soybeans, They're using pesticides to control weeds to try to enhance the growth of their desired crop. And pesticides have been a key part of what's been termed the agricultural revolution or the green revolution, where really from the mid 20th century, we've seen population grow and we've seen production of food grow substantially to support that population. Those things kind of go hand in hand. So these kinds of what are often termed innovations in the agricultural sector have allowed for growing a lot more food. Now, what are the trade-offs, right? We know that these are poisons that we're essentially putting on the landscape to control what we again deem as pests. And so it is absolutely the case we've seen over time that certain pesticides can have unintended consequences for non-target species. So we're trying to control one weed that may actually end up having impacts on other species that we care about. There's also been growing evidence that a lot of these chemicals can also affect human health if humans are exposed to these either through their drinking water or if maybe they're working around these chemicals relatively routinely. So it's a growing body of knowledge. There's a lot of concerning things that have been in the news and written about in recent years, but it's something that's absolutely still developing at a rapid pace in our news cycle. Something I'm sure you've heard about is the loss of honeybees across the United States and really worldwide. And one of the things that has been connected back to honeybees is the rise in the use of pesticides termed neonicotinoids. It's a type of pesticide that is similar in structure to nicotine. It's absorbed by plants. And when pollinators like honeybees are on a flower and they absorb or pull up that pollen, they can absorb the pesticide as a result of that. And so we've seen some really concerning declines in honeybees, but also a greater awareness that this is a problem. I understand that the European Union has banned neonicotinoid pesticides just in the last 2 years. And certain states in the United States have also started to take these kinds of actions. The National Geographic did a great article on this back in 2019, really highlighting the effect that neonicotinoids specifically are having on insect populations worldwide. Next slide. So there's a map. The main point I want you to take away from this map is that it's really quite common to find pesticides in our waterways. The U.S. Geological Survey does testing across the United States, and you can see it's a little bit darker shade of pink there in the middle of the country, Midwest, and in the Mississippi drainage basin. But in our region, we see it as well. Atrazine is a common type of pesticide used to control weeds for row crops, again, corn, soybeans, that kind of stuff. It's very widely used and it's very common in our waterways. One thing that's unique with glyphosate, atrazine, is that these are water soluble, meaning we may spray them on the ground, but they are, they readily dissolve in water and can leach into groundwater and certainly get into surface water supplies. So how that manifests itself in terms of impacts on aquatic life is it can affect behavior of fish. It can affect their immune system. It can sort of make them vulnerable to other diseases or things that would ultimately cause death or basically them to be unhealthy. And so we're not talking about toxic levels of atrazine in waterways. We're talking about enough to really be sort of a chronic, ongoing problem, adding additional stress to fish and wildlife. Hit one more click, please. So one thing that's unique in our region in the Chesapeake Bay, this has been documented for a few decades. You see this thing called intersex fish syndrome. So this is essentially a fish that has both male and female parts. And this is believed to be associated with, again, pesticides in waterways, but also other environmental stressors are likely influencing this. It can be other chemicals in the water that are coming from our wastewater treatment plants, pharmaceuticals and such. But atrazine and pesticides have been linked to this. And there's an ongoing study that the U.S. Geological Survey is doing in the Chesapeake Bay region to look at bass and how they're being affected by these chemicals in the waterways. And then finally, it also can affect the reproduction rate of fish-eating birds we've seen this, many decades ago in birds like bald eagles and peregrine falcons, that pesticides can work their way up the food chain and also impact those predators at the top. You can hit the next slide. And so a couple of comments just to close on this topic. There's clearly some concerns, and these have been discussed, I think, at length in sort of the public sphere, both the environmental health and human health. And so there's certainly some things that you want to pay attention to regarding herbicides and pesticides. Going back a long time, the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson really spawned, in many ways, a portion of the environmental movement. One of the outcomes from that book was greater awareness about pesticide pollution. DDT was banned. So you can definitely look back and see that there are certainly cases and evidence that people have caused improvements in terms of how we handle pesticides because of cultural shifts and then ultimately regulatory shifts where we have new laws, regulations to really control these things. The organic food movement is another example of this. Because pesticides are used so widely in our agricultural sector, it's certainly not uncommon to have traces of these things on things you'll buy at the store, your fresh fruit and vegetable aisle. The organic movement's all about growing food without those pesticides and making sure that we have cleaner products to provide to families and communities. So I mentioned the banning of some neonicotinoid pesticides in certain places already. I actually learned preparing for this presentation that a company that produces glyphosate, which is commonly referred to as Roundup, that has been linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in recent years. And there's been a number of class action lawsuits where the company is getting sued about this. So Bayer has announced they're going to stop selling glyphosate-based herbicides in 2023 for residential use. So again, that's sort of a response to ongoing litigation, but it's very concerning that this is still out there and certainly has some health and environmental consequences. So my advice, if you're a fan of Parks and Rec, I thought this is a good final photo to throw in. Go in informed. Be like Ron, going into your hardware store and armed with knowledge. We have to sort of break from the social norms of it's fine to buy these chemicals and spray them, abundantly on the landscape. That's a very normalized behavior. We're told that it's fine, but we do understand better today, I think, than ever before. There are consequences for the environment. And so you take on a lot of responsibility when you buy and use these things. So you got to make sure you're informed, be aware of what's in the product, how it's supposed to be used. Consider alternatives. There are many. You can go to the Extension Service in Virginia and learn about alternatives to using pesticides to control invasive plants or pests. There's sort of going back to the old ways. I've had issues with squash bugs in my garden. I've kind of learned that I can't grow squash 2 years in a row. That's how you kind of break free from their cycle. If you plant squash every other year, then you avoid having that pest on your plants. That's the sort of thing that is, an easy solution, which doesn't require the use of pesticides. So I encourage you to do your own research, go out and learn more, and share that information with your friends and your neighbors and folks that you talk to, because that's how we're going to, I think, really minimize the risk and reduce the use of pesticides, is by spreading that knowledge and really having more accountability for when and where these are used. All right, thanks. And I'm going to pass it over to Ryan to talk about compost and soil health.
All right, thank you, Jameson. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm going to talk about composting today. A lot of people have some misconceptions about what is composting, but I think everybody can agree about the stormwater and runoff benefits of applying it in our landscapes that we live in and work in every day. Certainly, it's a efficient alternative to fertilizer, but compost at its core is the decomposed organic matter, so carbon-based material, whether that's scraps of food, yard waste, garden trimmings, everything from meat to eggshells can be composted. That goes into kind of a controlled process of manufacturing or artificial replication of the natural process of decomposition to generate a consistent, high quality product. And the beauty about composting is that it's a scalable process. It's done at the industrial level, but everybody can compost at home as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that in this presentation. Next slide, please. So what exactly are the detrimental effects of runoff? Well, we've been talking a lot about it in this presentation so far, but I think at the core, you want to look at the agricultural and residential runoff sectors in the schematic here on the left. The runoff and stormwater that comes and enters our rivers and waterways generally tends to pick up these materials that tend to be detrimental to water quality, but also from water quantity standpoint. So you all have seen stormwater basins and channels and other infrastructure on the side of the road. Well, those things cost money. Those things treat not just the quality of the water that's going into our streams, but the influx of it, and it tries to reduce the peaks and high flows that occur during high precipitation events. So composting not only helps with increasing the water quality, serving as sort of a sponge or filter for things like heavy metals, pollutants, pesticides, but it also can soak up that water and prevent the huge surges from runoff from our cities and driveways. And the key point of compost as a substitute for fertilizer is that fertilizer typically is applied in its liquid form. It really easily runs off into places it's not supposed to be, and it tends to waste a lot of the constituents of the fertilizer that is supposed to be used to grow food, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and other macronutrients. Compost provides those same nutrients, but has a slow release. And also, being a solid versus a typical liquid, compost can be retained within the soil and not run off as easily as that liquid fertilizer. And a lot of us know the excess nitrogen, excess phosphates that go into water bodies can result in things like algal blooms there shown on the right. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that compost is decomposed organic matter, but it's also a soil mending product. One of the main benefits of composting is that you divert a resource such as the nutrients and cellulosic fibers inside the food scraps that you throw away. You divert those from landfilling and use them for a beneficial product. And those unwanted scraps can range from everything from food scraps to commercial process excesses like shells and husks, biosolids from wastewater treatment plants. A lot of yard waste programs will compost in addition to mulch, and all this material can be used in a composting process. The applications of compost are pretty vast. They're great for gardens and yards, but there's pretty large scale applications out there, and there's industrial and commercial scale applications as well. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of composting for runoff? How do you use it to reduce runoff? Well, compost when applied to soils enhances the structure of those soils. It provides much needed porosity or space, voids as we call them, where water can go and kind of stay stored for a lengthy period of time and help provide nourishment to plants. In addition to the water storage capacity, compost provides those nutrients and has a slow release that provides sustainable, consistent release of nutrients for healthy plant growth. And healthy plant growth has a lot of benefits for runoff, reducing the sedimentation or washing away of soils, improving embankments and increasing the structural integrity of them, and overall retaining land areas to stay on land and not in the waterways. Compost increases soil moisture retention, but also infiltration. And this is particularly helpful in sandy or clay soil. So soil that is absent of organic matter can be amended with compost to create what's essentially a natural topsoil that you can grow vegetative plants, trees, grasses in. A lot of you have seen construction sites on the side of the road where there's this very clayey structural soil being imported. A lot of times grass yards depend heavily on fertilizer to survive, and composting can kind of interject in that process and create a good topsoil-like amendment on top of that clay. One of the main applications for stormwater compost is as a literal filter. You can see compost sock in the bottom left corner and kind of a jumbo version of that in the upper right. These compost socks serve as literal filters for the water, where the particles of compost attract and retain the heavy metals, pesticides, fertilizers, macronutrients in excess, and other materials that shouldn't be washing away into the water, actually in the compost sock. And similarly, with bioretention gardens or bioretention basins and rain gardens, like what Jen showed in her presentation, compost can be used within those ponds to soak up the water directly and store them in the basins. Next slide, please. So how can you make compost? Well, again, it's scalable, ranges from local to regional. And I've got some examples of those three kind of sizes. The backyard composter on the left is what I've got. I use it to compost all of my food scraps, and there's room to spare. Sometimes I'll offer it to neighborhood people on the community web pages if they have some extra food scraps that they want to compost. In the middle is a community garden 3-bin system. So this is a little bit bigger. You've got about a cubic yard of operational space, about a cubic yard of storage space for finished product. And then not shown in the middle photo is the leaves and wood chips that are going into the compost to create the product. And on the right, we have an industrial scale composter. That's, I think, Spotsylvania County's something like 60 or 70,000 tons of yard waste and wood and biosolids go into that system every year. And out comes tens of thousands of tons of compost that are used throughout the county. Next slide, please. So anybody can be a composter. I've shown some of the key compost facilities within the state of Virginia here in the little blue dots. But one thing I really want to emphasize is that anybody can be a composter. So throughout the Commonwealth, in backyards and community gardens and local community groups, anybody can put in a compost system and contribute to the stormwater benefit and other environmental stewardship aspects of compost. Next slide, please. So I know you all are interested in how to apply it at home. I know we had a couple different questions already, and Heidi was asking about how to keep out pests coming in from the bottom of the bin. Well, a lot of compost bins are piles and heaps, as those are shown on the right side there. Typically, you use chicken wire or other metal mesh to kind of contain the compost. These bins don't require very much maintenance. You turn it every now and then and add a little bit of water. You want a moisture feel similar to that of a squeezed out sponge. And nature will do its thing and it'll decompose down into a useful product. The bins and containers on the left side there are purchasable. You can purchase at Lowe's or Home Depot. They're under $100 typically. You can see mine in the top there, the rolling bin, and the finished product that I put on my yard every year, about twice a year, as an alternative to fertilizers purchased from the store. And so there's a lot of different styles out there. I can answer questions about those later on. Yeah, I appreciate everybody's time and I'm open to any questions you might have. Feel free to contact me directly if you'd like after the presentation.
Thanks so much, Ryan. That was super informative. Next up, we have Laura Greenleaf with the James River Park System Invasive Plant Task Force.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura, and 7 years ago, I founded the James River Park System Invasive Plant Task Force as a volunteer and have been involved with them since. But as of last August, I do work for the Park System in invasive plant management coordination, but I am also an early member of the River Hero Homes program, and I have the cup to prove it. Next slide. Yep, so we're just going to do a speed version of an introduction to invasive and native plant ecology. And next slide. Ecologists widely recognize that on a global basis, invasive species, be they pathogens, plants, or animals, come in second to outright habitat destruction in terms of being harmful to biological diversity. Next slide. What do we mean when we say native or non-native and invasive? Native or indigenous species are those that are known to have occurred within a particular geographic range over geologic time, meaning since the last glaciation. For practical purposes, in the US, the benchmark is considered prior to European contact and settlement. Invasive species are, by definition, introduced from somewhere else, but not all introduced species become invasive. Some are naturalized and behave themselves, but the invasives are just naturally prone to runaway expansion for various reasons I'll touch on in a couple more slides. And they have negative impacts on ecosystems and natural habitats. Next slide. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Department of Conservation and Recreation Natural Heritage Program does formally recognize 90 plant species that are invasive here. That doesn't mean that there aren't others that are poised to be added to that list. There is a systematic process for this. And just, you don't have to go back to the previous slide, but of those 90, over 50 are present in the James River Park system. Their impacts are many, beginning at the ground level. They do alter soil chemistry and hydrology, how water moves through a natural system. They alter community structure, most noticeably by overtopping tree canopy, by their abundance, their density, which results in suppressing a succession of trees and shrubs, and also in eliminating the herbaceous layer. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they alter the actual composition, the community composition, meaning reduction of biodiversity. They can literally wipe out native species locally, or they simply reduce them to very small, limited populations. Next slide. And then it's kind of a case of you know it when you see it. And this is Huguenot flatwater, really a monoculture of invasive winter creeper, Euonymus fortunei, dense ground cover there, overtopping the trees. The paler green is Amur honeysuckle and privet, dominant invasive shrubs throughout the park system. So it's not just the shock of having over 50 individual invasive species present in the park. It is their abundance and their dominance that is so consequential. And throughout the park system, most of the park is at 50% invasive cover or above, and actually, and much of it is at 75% invasive cover or above. Next slide. So similar situation here at Pony Pasture, just down the road from Huguenot. This is a before photo of what I call the Rapids Restoration Area, a demonstration project. Next slide. And over the course of years, truly, I mean, now 7 years of manual removal of invasive winter creeper, which is an incredibly arduous task. And it is not something that is a feasible management method on a larger scale. This is very much a demonstration area. So you can see those mountains of incredibly heavy winter creeper. It's probably the most difficult thing to manually remove. Next slide. And if you go down to Pony Pasture in about a couple of months, this is what it will look like. I took this picture a couple of years ago. But as gorgeous as this is, it's important to understand that there is no such thing as after when it comes to invasive management. it's forever. It's a forever commitment wherever you're working. It has to be a long-term management plan with continual monitoring and follow-up. Next slide. So if you are interested in learning more, or if you need to control invasive species on your own property, I recommend starting out at the Department of Conservation and Recreation to learn the basics about invasives. Also, Blue Ridge PRISM, Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, has become a really fantastic resource statewide, even though they are focused west of our region. And then you can go to invasive.org to find an excellent field guide to invasive species of the mid-Atlantic. Now, protecting and planting native species, it's important to understand that when we say native, we mean locally native. And so you want to get a hold of the Plant Virginia RVA Natives guide, which is one of a number of regional guides available through the Plant Virginia Natives campaign. Virginia Native Plant Society, pretty self-explanatory as a resource for native plants. And you've probably heard about Doug Ptolemy, the entomologist, who over the years has become just a leading prophet of native plant ecology and the difference it can make right at home in your own garden or yard. Next slide. And if you do visit the Virginia Native Plant Society, you might want to look for the statement on cultivars. If you're confused about selecting plants for your own projects at home, you need to learn about why you probably want to steer away from most cultivars, because they do alter plants in ways that can affect ecological balance and make them basically unusable to pollinators in particular. You will find that there. And as well as a list of native plant nurseries and sales, including two of our own locals, Reedy Creek Environmental and Molten Hot Native Plants. It's really important to understand what you are purchasing and that you're getting plants that are truly suited to the habitat and that are locally native. For instance, probably most people think that purple coneflower is this great native plant, when in fact, it is not native to Virginia, and it actually contributes, it's considered one potentially threatening to a native coneflower species. Next slide. You know, and again, why do we want to make the switch to native plants? And the obvious reason is that they are the host plants and the food plants for native pollinators. Butterflies are obviously the kind of charismatic species that people focus on, but pollinators include flies and wasps as well, and of course native bee species. And that tends to be what people focus on. And then of course they produce seeds that native songbirds rely on in the fall and winter, cover. But those root systems are critical when it comes to conserving water and contributing to stormwater runoff control. And as was brought up earlier, the turf grass, the lawn grass there on the far left, essentially functions like a pervious surface. It's really not much better than asphalt or cement. But those native plants have these incredibly expansive, deep root systems that take up and filter and purify and slow down stormwater runoff. Next slide. So the James River Park System Invasive Plant Task Force, if you want to get beyond your own home and do something about the impact of invasive plants on our park system, we would love to have you join us as a volunteer. Volunteers are truly the backbone, no pun intended, of the work. James River Association is one of the partners in that coalition. They have been working regularly for years on Chapel Island, Great Shiplock Park. The reason the task force formed was to take this really coordinated, thoughtful, strategic, long-term approach to the threat, the ecological threat of invasive plants to the park system. We don't have any high-minded goals of eradicating invasive plants in the park system. That's just not possible. So what we want to do is focus on certain areas, protect certain resources, and tilt the balance back to native flora. Next slide. Oh, it's a little bit different than my original, but if you look in that, that's the website for the task force. And if you look at the upper right, you'll see that there's a calendar option, and all those events will appear on that calendar if you want to get into invasive management. And also next week is a great time to start because it is National Invasive Species Awareness Week. We are holding a kickoff event at Pony Pasture Sunday afternoon. Please come on out. There will be goats if that doesn't persuade you. And then there are volunteer events throughout the park system all week long. Next slide. And a little more persuasion. These are all native plant species, and all but 2 of those photos are of species just naturally occurring right here in Richmond, a few of them in my own yard, and then and then a garden at a local school, landscaped with plants mostly from Reedy Creek Environmental. So you too can have these plants right outside your window, and that's it. Whoops, was that me?
Thank you so much, Laura. And yeah, shout out to Reedy Creek Environmental and Molten Hot Natives, 2 of our River Hero Homes partners. Before we conclude this webinar, I want to share some of the benefits of the River Hero Homes program. First, members of the program receive a garden flag, sticker, membership card, and a family membership to the James River Association for 1 year. And the membership card that you receive from us provides you with discounts at nurseries and garden centers across the watershed. And Reedy Creek and Environmental and Molten Hot Natives are 2 of those businesses that you will receive discounts at. Second, members receive advance notice about programs including rain barrel workshops that Jen mentioned a little while ago. And just so you know, rain barrel workshops are tentatively scheduled for the spring, and details are coming your way very soon. Lastly, members receive exclusive access to River Hero Homes webinars. And this spring, during our April Showers, May Flowers promotion, we're excited to offer webinars on rain barrels and native plants. We'll take an even more deeper dive into both rain barrels and native plants during those webinars. And of course, to join the River Hero Homes program, visit thejamesriver.org. Next slide. All right, it's time for questions. This is a reminder that if you have any questions for our presenters, please submit them via the chat box. Their email addresses are also listed on this slide for your reference if you prefer to reach out to them after the webinar. And let's see what we have. I know that Ryan has answered a number of questions about composting in the chat box. So let's see. What do we get? A lot of questions about composting. Ryan, do you want to touch a little bit on letting leaves cover your yard and maybe using them as mulch? I see there's a question that says, is letting leaves cover the yard helpful to reduce runoff?
Yeah, I would recommend leaving them as much as the suitability for your own situation allows. So I know a lot of folks do it because it does allow for a greater retention of water. It allows for more nutrients to go in the soil. Although leaves aren't particularly nutrient heavy, they do have some benefit from a macronutrient standpoint. I think the biggest benefit of the leaf leaving is you don't have to break your leaves, and typically the grass will be fine. One thing that I tend to do is I use an electric blower mulcher. So basically a blower in reverse to kind of size reduce the leaves, and that enables them to kind of get down in the crevices between the grass, so the grass can still get the sun right up until the end of the fall, but also gets the benefit of the leaves being worked into the soil. So that's kind of what I do personally.
And as you've composted in your backyard, have you encountered any critters getting into your bin over the years?
Yeah, so what I do in my yard, I have two separate bins. One is kind of a general yard trimmings composter with leaves added on, and I'll sometimes put things like lettuce and like cilantro, chives, herbs, things like that in that bin, and that's an open wire bin, so it's pretty exposed to the outside elements and potentially critters. They tend to not go for that sort of material, so it's still compost. It's a little slower. But I do all of my really heavy food scraps, things like banana peels and potatoes, things that are really desirable to those vermin in an enclosed bin, because I'm right in the heart of the city. There's, neighbors within 15 feet of the bin on either side. So I tend to try to do that just to eliminate the possibility of critters getting into that main bin.
We have a question about dog waste composting. And it sounds like some local governments may be offering dog waste composting workshops, which is pretty interesting. And it's certainly information that, as we become aware of it, we can share with our River Hero Homes network. I personally don't know too much about composting dog waste. Aaron Riley or Jen Clark, do you all have any insights into composting dog waste by chance?
Yeah, so one of the things, I was in the middle of sort of typing a long response. So you brought this up, but so I've heard of people just having like separate composts for this one dog waste goes into and this one dog waste doesn't go into, and it's still like a regular compost system. They say that if you do that, make sure that you don't use the compost that has dog waste in it on anything that you plan to eat. So no fruits, no vegetables, no lettuces, nothing like that. But you could use it on other areas of your garden where you're not necessarily going to be eating any of the products in your flower beds, near trees, things like that. But you definitely want to be careful, because if the compost piles don't get high enough, they don't kill off all of the bacteria. One of the things that I was suggesting is that it's a doggy septic system as opposed to composting. Composting, it's above ground, and essentially you would be reusing that soil, whereas with a septic system, the bacteria and the waste slowly breaks down as rain gets into it and water gets into it and things. It slowly breaks down and it goes into the soil. And so it's not like going onto the top layers where you're going to be interacting with it and things. So it's a lot safer for you, because you won't be exposed to bacteria, or if your dogs have any parasites, anything like that. So that's one of the things that why I was suggesting the septic systems instead of a separate compost system. But from what I understand, and I'm definitely not an expert, I don't even have a dog. From what I understand, though, if you're going to compost your dog waste, make sure that you don't use that on your fruits and vegetables and anything that you plan to eat.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It looks like we have a question about parking. The question is, what are we advised to say, do when we see park users littering, outdoor cooking, parking everywhere, etc.? There does not seem to be any consequence. This is more of a general question for our panelists, and I'll jump in and just say that I like to demonstrate stewardship in personally in my personal life publicly. So I feel like actions speak louder than words. So if you happen to see trash on the ground, picking it up and being a good steward of your neighborhood, your public spaces, and letting others see you in action is a great way to hopefully change behavior. And if you ever have a situation where you have excessive litter, or you feel like things are a little bit out of control, you can always report it to your local parks department, or whatever space it may be happening in. Don't know if anybody else would like to jump in there, but thank you for that question.
I'll chime in on that one a little bit from a municipal standpoint, because it can be really frustrating. And I understand that maybe the answer isn't a desirable, like it takes a village. Sometimes like if you've called 911 or non-emergency police, they might think that request is a little silly. So I would try code enforcement. Tends to have a slightly higher chance of having somebody who is there to administer a fine. Now you might not make a lot of friends if you're doing that to everybody you see instead of setting a good example. But that is a way to maybe indicate, like, okay, this park's having a big problem, or this apartment complex just keeps throwing trash out the back. Code enforcement can be a way, and most counties and cities have a way for you to get in contact with somebody who's in that role rather than a law enforcement role.
Thank you so much, Jen. I've got another question for you. How can renters try to harvest water or reduce stormwater?
Aaron, this is such a fun question. Okay, I've been in my apartment for 6 years, which is a long time to be in an apartment, but that's fine. So as a general rule, you could be working really hard to tap into water on a balcony, should you have one. I am trying the ground up method of encouraging our complex as a whole to do a downspout disconnect. It's not going well, but maybe anyone else will have more luck than I do. And that would be to have that complex, most complexes go directly into your stormwater system. So I'm in the Shaka Bottom, it goes directly into our combined system. You might be in the separated system, it would go just into your local storm drain pipe, like your stormwater pipe, but not necessarily onto the road first. That would probably be the way to go, would be a cistern, because it's a huge volume of water, or they could go more like a green roof or a rooftop garden, would be awesome things to see more of in Central Virginia. But it's definitely, it would be hard as an individual if you weren't funneling water magically off a patio, which might not be allowed based on your apartment agreement in the first place.
Thank you for that, Jen. And I don't see any other questions. So that concludes the webinar. Thanks again to Altria and DuPont Clear into the Future for making this webinar possible.
Justin.
Thank you. Yes, Erin.
Sorry, there's actually one more question that just came in.
Great. Here's a question. Rain, Jen, what pushback are you getting from neighbors about harvesting rainwater?
I'm going to ask anyone who's willing to help me with clarification for that. If Drew, are you getting pushback from your neighbors? Or like my apartment complex is not into the, this is so, Jamie, stop it. Okay, I'm gonna take Drew. My apartment complex is a whole block, like times 6. So they just don't want to invest in that right now. Pretend that I have my own house, because this is an easier way to answer your question. And my neighbor is not into my rain barrel. They probably are thinking of mosquitoes. So you want a decent net to prevent any from getting in. That's like real easy, just like the same sort of material that you'd find on your window. You can find it at Home Depot or Lowe's, or it's handy at a lot of more local hardware stores. Beyond that, I haven't seen pushback from a neighbor or like heard any real, like, I don't like rain barrel situations. But if you have more, let me know. Otherwise, it's just that Brookfield Properties does not want to separate the 6 apartments in a row down here in Shaka Bottom.
I have heard that homeowners associations can be challenging to work with when it comes to installing rain barrels on homes. So that, yeah, I could see there being some pushback there, Drew. Thanks for that question. All right, I think any more questions coming in, Erin?
I think we're good, Justin. Thanks for checking.
Thank you so much for helping to field the questions this evening, Erin. And shout out to my colleagues, Mason Manley and Angie Williams, who've been working behind the scenes to support this webinar. But thanks again to Altria and DuPont Clear into the Future for making this webinar possible. Thank you to Jamie, Erin, Jen, Ryan, and Laura for sharing their knowledge with us. And thank you for tuning in. Please visit thejamesriver.org to learn about the James River Association and our River Hero Homes program, and get out and enjoy this beautiful evening. And we'll see you soon.